Hey everyone, still talking about development, and this time it'll be mainly about adolescence and adulthood. So starting with adolescence, this is the stage between being a child and being an adult. So in terms of grades, you could think like middle school to the first couple years of high school is about what I would say. So roughly like 11 or 12 to 17, maybe 18. Um, Puberty, on the other hand, that's a scientific term. So that is something biological that happens. That's when your sexual organs mature. And so for women, this is usually around 11 or 12, and that's when they first menstruate. And then around 11 or 13 or 14 for boys. So they always hit puberty a little bit later. That's why you'll hear that like girls are more mature, sort of where that stereotype is from. Is just because developmentally they're a little bit ahead of boys. So Kohlberg's stages of moral reasoning, he basically was looking at how do young people sort of develop their morals, their beliefs, and how they work through particular problems. And one of the examples he used was if somebody needs a medication to save someone in their family, but they don't have enough money to pay for the medication, should they steal it or not? And so by like posing this to different people at different ages, he came up with this idea of three stages. And so the first stage is for the youngest. So these are going to be, littler kids, so more childhood era. And this would be the pre-conventional stage. And basically with this, there's just concrete rules. Stealing is bad. And that's the only sort of explanation you would get. You shouldn't take the medication because stealing is bad. And then at level 2, the conventional stage, this is more about societal rules. And so then they start thinking like, well, if everybody stole, then what would happen? There'd be, sort of anarchy or whatever. And that's going to be like middle school age. And then the hope is that you get to the post-conventional stage 3, which is the most complex, and it's basically just people understanding that there's gray areas, that nothing is black and white, and it's not such an easy answer for the problem. One of the criticisms of Kohlberg and his idea is that he was mostly focusing on boys and men, and there are people who argue that if you were looking at girls and women, they might, because they're socialized differently, they might have different reactions to the problem. And then going back to Erik Erikson's theory, so these are his 4 stages for adolescence to adulthood. So we talked about the 4 for childhood. This is, remember, where you're trying to sort of solve a crisis so you can move on to the next stage. And so the first one, identity versus role confusion, this is in adolescence. And basically, it's just basically somebody trying to figure out their identity and who they are and what sort of role that they're going to follow. You may have had I feel like I had this conversation a lot when I was in high school. It was just like, oh, so-and-so, she is always pretending to be somebody else depending on what group she's around, which, sometimes we would find frustrating, but that's actually a really normal thing that younger people do when they're trying to figure out which identity does fit for them. So they try out different ones until, they sort of make a decision that this is what they're going with. Intimacy versus isolation. So this is going to be early adulthood. So think like 18 to 25-ish. And this is where people are focusing on relationships and building intimacy and how that's going to look with one another. Okay, the next one generativity versus stagnation. So this is middle adulthood. So this is going to be like 25 to 30 to 40-ish. And basically this book didn't talk about it very much, but in my full lifespan class, one of the sort of big arguments or discussions, I guess I should say, about this stage is that it's about whether you have kids or not. And that Erickson kind of put forth that, you know, people don't feel resolved that they made a contribution to society unless they have someone to carry on sort of their genetic line, right? So there's, you know, different feelings and controversies and things to think about with that. But that's part of resolving that crisis. And then the last one, ego integrity versus despair. It would be later adulthood, so I think 65 and up. And this is just, you know, sort of reviewing what has your life been. Do you feel satisfied with what you've done? Do you feel accomplished? Do you have any regrets? Things like that. For social development and adolescence, the book talked about suicide and how, you know, it's an issue because it's the third leading cause of death in adolescence right now in the US after homicides and accidents. Males are 5 times more likely to commit suicide than females, but females attempt suicide more often. And the reason why is because men are more likely to use lethal means. So they're more likely to use a gun. And women try more often, but they're more likely to try something less lethal. So maybe they take pills. That takes longer, more of an opportunity of somebody to intervene. The rates are higher among white people than non-white people. And of course, there's a lot of different causes for suicide: depression, social anxiety, family background, drug and alcohol use. All of those things affect somebody's decision. The main thing that I would tell you is anytime it's a concern or you aren't sure what's, you know, somebody's thinking, the best thing that you can do is be direct and just ask, are you thinking about suicide? It feels awkward. It feels like, oh, if I talk about it, does that mean they're going to start thinking about it? Absolutely not. All the research shows that most people benefit if you just ask them outright, because then that gives them an opportunity to talk with someone about it. So yeah, number one thing, just, you know, don't hesitate and be bold and ask. So physical development for adulthood, you are basically the healthiest that you're ever going to be from 18 to 25. That's when the majority of people, their body's at their peak. After 25, you start becoming more susceptible to illness. Major changes for women start happening in late 40s, early 50s with menopause. This is when their period stops and they aren't fertile anymore, so they couldn't have a child anymore. For men, they don't have that sort of same physical marker of difference. There's transitions for midlife. Of course, I'm sure you've heard of midlife crises. That is sort of a myth. Most people don't have major midlife crisis. There is usually a reflection point, which they're calling the midlife transition, where people start thinking like, okay, I am in my early 40s. Am I doing what I want to do? Is there anything that I want to change up before I like hit the second half of my life? So that's something you'll see kind of typically with clients, but just the average person isn't having a major crisis. And I think, I don't want to say the wrong statistic. I want to say when people started measuring like the number like percentage of people that have like an actual midlife crisis, or they like change something super significant or feel in serious turmoil about their life, is like 10%. But don't quote me on that. I could be wrong. Marriage, children, divorce. Average age of marriage is getting higher, particularly in the US, but it's also getting higher around the world. There's more cohabitation before marriage, so just people feel less pressure to get married and live together. Obviously, all of this is kind of followed along what's happening culturally. So there's just less religious pressure to get married and stay married. And we know now, I'm sure you've heard this, that about half of all first marriages, sorry if you can hear Kinsey, about half of all first marriages end in divorce. So pretty high divorce rate right now. 75% of married women with school-age children are employed outside the home. So most families, if they are a two-parent household, both are working. It's very difficult to be a single parent or have one income. And yeah, people have to work. There's not a lot of opportunities for being a stay-at-home parent these days, just with the financial situation and the economy. Physical changes in late adulthood. So now we're talking about ages 65 and up. There's sort of two theories about what happens to our bodies. The first one is the genetic pre-programming. Basically, the idea is like our cells are programmed, and at a certain point, they're going to stop replicating. We're not really in control of that, and it's just going to happen at whatever point. The wear and tear theory is just like it sounds. Like our bodies just take so much, and eventually they're going to wear down and not be able to replicate to keep us, healthy. So yeah, there's not I would say like a lot of controversy about these. It's just whatever sort of fits with the biological model that sounds right to you. Cognitive changes. So I think this is important because we do have a tendency to assume that people who are older aren't as have as much intellectual depth and things like that. What we know is that fluid intelligence, so that's things like memory, calculations, solving analogies, do show a decline. However, their crystallized knowledge, so this is strategies that they figured out, skills that they have, remain steady, and they're still able to do a lot of things that they did in sort of middle or emerging adulthood. They've had so many years to build that up that the skills are second nature, and they don't lose a lot in that. And the other thing that's on here, memory loss, it's not inevitable with aging. It's all going to be dependent on the person and sort of what's going on with them. You should not assume that just because a person is older that they're going to lose pieces of their memory. And lastly, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of dealing with your impending death. She identified these. Basically, the main thing to think about with these 5, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, is that everybody goes through these stages in some way. It just might look different for each person. So like, for example, bargaining. For somebody who's really religious, they might have conversations with God and think about how they could bargain in that relationship. Somebody else who is not religious might bargain with themselves in a way and think like, okay, I'm going to start eating vegan from now on. And if I eat vegan, then that will postpone my death. So they're both bargaining. It just looks a little bit different depending on who the person is. So that's how all of the stages sort of work. And that's it for this development. Last thing I'll say is that this is just such a little tiny piece, and if you're all interested in this information, I highly suggest taking the full lifespan development class.